the Queen adopted quite a friendly tone towards the European Union. My government intends to work towards a new partnership with the EU based on free trade and friendly cooperation. She also said the government's economic strategy will be underpinned by a responsible fiscal strategy, which of course will be interesting to those who have watched Boris Johnson promise to spend north of 7 billion beyond what he can raise in any given year when it comes to tax. So that will of course mean more borrowing, which of course was Ed Miliband, it was actually before Gordon Brown and Tony Blair were criticised for borrowing more than the Treasury receives in tax receipts. And then there were the obvious ones in terms of law and order. Offenders will spend longer in custody to better reflect the seriousness of their crimes. That's a nod, of course, to legislation to make those convicted of the most serious crimes serve 2/3 of their sentences and not a half of it.
Legislation that is entirely unnecessary because of the existence of extended determinate sentences. But we're not supposed to point that out because that's designed for tomorrow's headlines. And also, in the event of the Queen's speech being voted down next week, the Conservatives can pretend that they believe that Parliament has voted down tougher sentences for paedophiles. It will play quite well in focus groups, no doubt, despite being completely false.
Yes. Government also taking steps, the Queen said, to make work fairer to better help those who work hard. Read into that possible tax cuts. Of course, that money will have to be found from somewhere. And then on the environment, at the very end of that speech, the Queen talked about establishing environmental principles to be enshrined in law with legally binding targets. And there's she mentioned a new body to set up to monitor the environment, make sure that people weren't abusing the environment. I've got the detail here. It's a new Office for Environmental Protection. You will, of course, remember in the wake of the 2010 election, David Cameron's government promised a bonfire of the Quangos. This is a new Quango.
Well, there was also supposed to be a bonfire of regulations as well as a result of leaving the European Union. Some concern in environmental circles that Boris Johnson would repeal protections put in place as members. Does that suggest that those fears are unfounded?
It would suggest the government it obviously sees the environment as a huge issue. Point you towards Stanley Johnson, the Prime Minister's father, of course, was protesting alongside Extinction Rebellion, and of course the Prime Minister's partner, Carrie Symonds, has been a long-term advocate of promoting animal rights and also protecting the environment as well. She worked on campaigns to ensure that plastic bags did not find their way into marine life as well. So there's a focus there on the environment too.
26 putative bills, 7 of which address issues of crime and justice. I'm intrigued, and I appreciate as a proper journalist rather than a pundit, you may not join in this sense of intrigue, but I am genuinely intrigued to know whether or not the crime and justice ticket works after 9 years in government as well as it does when you're coming in after a Labour government. And of course those 9 years in government for the Conservatives have seen government deliberately and consciously reduce police numbers by about 20,000. And as we received a masterclass for a forthcoming podcast from the secret barrister, utterly filleted the criminal justice system. But as ever, and it's almost boring to return to this refrain, it doesn't matter about reality. All that matters is Sun headlines.
That was a problem at the Conservative Party conference.
Was it?
Where you had ministers standing up and saying, well, we're going to deal with this and we're going to deal with that. The NHS, Boris Johnson said he went and he visited a hospital in Greater Manchester, I think it was Manchester Royal Infirmary, where the doctors told him and the nurses told him that they couldn't do their jobs properly because the equipment facilities weren't good enough. And he likened that to Premier League footballers having to play on a ploughed field. James, well, of course, the government that is ultimately responsible for the ploughed field of the lack of facilities and equipment at Manchester Royal Infirmary was the Conservative government led by David Cameron in 2010. And because you've got 9 years, it's impossible to say, oh, well, it was the last lot that did
That's what I mean, yes.
So it was Tony Blair's fault. Oh, it was
that's what I just wonder whether it will work as well as a rhetorical or electoral device. Because I mean, make no mistake, Theo, but that Queen's speech was essentially the first formal sounding of the election bugle.